Welcome back to Adventures in DevOps. A prevailing opinion in the tech world is that it has been hard to hire technology leaders, especially principal and staff engineers, heads of engineering, and tech leaders. So all of you listening to this episode, hopefully. Personally, for me, it has never been easier as a hiring manager to find candidates. Most of my inbox is filling up with thousands of candidates, which means we have way more to choose from. Never mind that most of those are probably state actors, bots, or people who don't even exist. I'm very thankful for the size of the pile, though, because we all know size matters. To help us cut through all the theory on what's happening and focus on their real world experiences with interviewing and hiring, we've brought in the previous head of developer ecosystem at Splunk and now the head of AI R&D at Cribl and a longtime software engineer. I want to introduce Nikhil Mungel to the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Warren. Appreciate you having me on.
Well, I feel like we sort of touched on hiring in almost every single episode to date. There's always someone who wants to talk about AI or talk about the impacts to inexperienced engineers or the challenges of actually hiring. And I didn't think that anyone was in the perfect position to actually talk about that. So I'm actually really excited for getting your perspectives on real world experiences in trying to go through that. Maybe if you could just quickly share what you had seen historically and maybe now what's changed and what you're doing about it.
Totally. I'll just lead with that, right? I mean, I'm seeing a lot more poor quality applications, in the last couple of years than I did it previously, right? So before LLMs took off in a really big way, most of the applications, most of the interviews felt a lot more genuine and higher quality applications. And now I feel like there's been an increase in the volume of applications, but there's been a drop in the average quality of applications. We can theorize, why that's the case. People are obviously, using AI to help apply for jobs, create resumes and, even really quickly come up to speed on certain topics that they previously were not up to speed on. But then advertising that as oh, cool, like this is the expertise that, they're bringing in, which sometimes doesn't line up, in the interview process, right? So you have a lot more people falling off in the hiring pipeline when we go through the different interview stages.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary of what we're seeing here. One of the interesting things that I've sort of noticed is that historically, a lot of companies were able to get by with either not doing that rigorous of a review of the interviewing process or having a high attention to how to even do things like phone screenings or those first stages of interviews and have historically really relied on the resumes. And now we're basically seeing that the resumes either are too large in number to basically have that sort of attention to. A lot of them are, as you put, like low quality. And so even reviewing them aren't so great. My historical perspective has always been the resume is written by a candidate, which tells me what they want us to know rather than what we want to know. And so I always looked at it as like a preference, right? If you write, you have 10 years of JavaScript experience, I'm going to assume you love JavaScript. If you tell me you have 10 years of PHP experience, I'm going to assume you love PHP. Even if the job we're hiring for is for Rust or TypeScript, I'm going to assume that about you because you could put anything in there. And we historically haven't done huge background checks. We don't go to every single company you list and say, what technology choices were you using at this time? And was this person working on that specific tech? Like, who's going to do that? It doesn't really offer a huge amount of value. And I feel like now it sort of really is outshined. There's very low opportunity to get that feeling from the resume you're looking at because it, as you point out, it's often completely fabricated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, fabricated. And, that's definitely amounted to some loss of trust in the hiring process, just because, I mean, I'm sure you have gone through this as well, when you're interviewing somebody and you see their eyes darting all around and, sometimes, you can even hear a little voice assistant, that happened to me once, which is kind of weird. And I feel, it's a shame because I feel like as an industry, we were doing really well when it came to remote work and, just trusting people to do the right thing. And now I feel like I can't help but think about there's going to be a regression in that, right? I mean, we are going to bring back in-person interviews with a couple of people sitting in a room with a whiteboard, no technology. I mean, some companies are already doing that. When I talk to my network, working at other companies, a lot of companies have reverted to that. And, there's no longer, I mean, remote work is unfortunately suffering as a result of this loss in societal trust. And it kind of pains me to say this is because I mean I've been in this industry like on the AI side of things for like the last 7 or 8 years at this point, and it's a phenomenal technology, but then it also gives people a way to like game the system or just not be authentic. So that's I feel like the thing that I miss the most is the authenticity that I used to experience with candidates pre LLMs and the experience that you have today, which is just it just feels less authentic. Like you never know if you're really getting an insight from a candidate that's coming from their own experiences, or is just some like slop that's being generated on the site that they're reading on the fly, or just
Well,
that's been challenging aspect of hiring. And I've like I feel like we have developed antibodies as an interview panel as a company as well, like, and I'm sure you have, I'm sure every hiring manager has developed their own system of filtering out the noise and sticking with like high quality signal. So I've been fortunate that I've been able to actually hire solid people in the last year. It's taken more work. It's taken more
mm.
effort to like find good quality people.
Yeah, so I think there's a huge aspect there, realistically, where it does feel like we've regressed in what we're doing, and I don't think it's just on the hiring side. I've sort of noticed this as a trend in decades of software engineering that what was old is new again. We see just as similarly in hard technology organizational structures such as QA and platform engineering sort of pop up again. And there was a huge time where, with a focus on DevOps, we said we don't need these things. Everyone is responsible for everything. If you build it, you run it, you ship it, you manage it, you talk to customers. And now I feel like we're seeing these organizations pop up that do revert to an earlier time where they're like, well, you know what? We need to have huge org structures dedicated to everything around software engineering, completely defeating the whole movement that was there and also shifting away from agile. And I feel like the same thing is happening with hiring as well. We see that historically it was who you know, your network, sometimes nepotism, getting in a room with people, handshake deals to find the best candidates who you wanted to work with to hire. And then we're like, you know what? This isn't the whole pool to choose from. There's lots of people in many countries that can offer just as high value to us, maybe even better, bring in increased diversity, which all the research says is incredibly critical. But now we're shifting sort of back away from that and saying, oh, who do you know? Let's hire your friends or
Right.
colleagues or acquaintances
Yeah.
that you know. And so I totally agree with you. There is a huge regression here. How have
Yeah.
you been dealing with this problem?
Yeah. Before I do that, I just want to validate what you just said. And a pretty good insight that you just had, right? I mean, like, what's old is new again. There's definitely been a pendulum, like, going back and forth between technology, the cloud on-prem. I mean, with LLMs,
Yeah,
we like one sorry to go on a tangent here, but you're a tech nerd just like I am, and separation of storage and compute was one of
right.
like the biggest unlocks in the last decade. And guess what? With LLMs, it's back to the same thing, right? I mean, like the storage and the compute is just all codified in the LLM's weights.
Right.
So we're just seeing this all across the industry where we're just going back to a world where networking matters. You want to, like, people are looking for that or something that signals authenticity, which, and the easiest and the cheapest way to get that is by a referral, right? I mean, like, oh, I've worked with this person in the past. And the downside of that is, you're limiting the pool of candidates to this smaller, bubble. Not nepotistic, but certainly,
Yeah.
getting into that direction, and you're missing out on the diversity of, just hiring a stranger from the internet, where you would just get somebody from outside of your industry, somebody from outside of your bubble, and especially here in San Francisco, it's a small city, like it's a pretty small set of engineers and managers and everyone else, and you do want to bring in fresh talent, you want to bring in fresh perspectives. One of the really cool parts about Cribl is we're a remote first company. So, we hire people from all across the country, from, really small towns, really small places as well, which is fantastic because every time, we hire somebody like that, they just teach us how to do things in a radically different way than what we have been doing. So yeah, let's get into some of the techniques, that I've been applying to, filter out authenticity. One thing that jumps to my mind is, okay, so let me take a step back and, talk about coding and, just technology. And that's just been commoditized rather quickly with, all agentic coding harnesses and, models, right? So Cloud Code can basically do most of what software development used to entail, right? So the job of a software engineer now has evolved, right? Or a DevOps engineer has evolved. And it's more about judgment as opposed to the executive function of, going in and typing out code character by character, right? So you're like, hey, can you compare? Can you tell me whether A is better than B? So one phrase I really like is now everyone is a judgment worker as opposed to being a
Mm.
knowledge worker, right? So like, how will you as a human being bring unique judgment and taste into whatever the problem that the team is solving, right? Like, be that a systems problem or an engineering problem or even a business problem, a product problem. And that's really been the key unlock in my mind, right? Like, so when I evaluate candidates, I'm not looking as much for the latent knowledge that they just have in their heads about, an obscure syntax or something else. It's just about like, hey, how will you judge that approach A is better than approach B in a situation, right? So it just comes down to system design type of interviews where, you're talking about different trade-offs. You're talking about, it's like, hey, if I show you one and two, like, what's better. So that's one thing that comes to mind. But I'm curious to know, like, if you've experienced similar things in your hiring
Yeah,
process.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we took an approach that migrated to that sort of a long time ago. From the very beginning, I think the roots of where I came from, which was very not software driven. I worked in technical support for healthcare organizations and, hands on the ground, but having to jump in and talk with actual customers and what they were facing forced me into a career path where I was always thinking about where was the value in what was I was providing in the previous 10 years. And when I shifted into leadership roles, I always was thinking, well, what is the value of software engineering in whatever we're doing in this regard? So LLMs didn't particularly change that for me, but it was definitely a hard sell for a lot of people because I said, you know what? Is software engineering a competitive advantage for our company? And I think a lot of companies that aren't very technical jump up and say, no, of course not. But ones with lots of engineering departments say, no, software engineering is a, critical capacity that we have. It's the thing that makes us stand out. But if you actually look at the business model and the types of people that they hired, you can usually see, no, that actually isn't the case. And now I feel like since technology often wasn't a company's competitive advantage, it's very easy, as you pointed out, if software development is commoditized, or if it's just a utility, then you don't need to hire the best engineers or use the best LLM models or harnesses to get software developed. And then the question is, what's left? And I think you're absolutely right. What's left is making real-time business decisions, but closer to the technology that you're creating.
100%, right? I mean, like, it's just expanding upon, that core art of writing code or, generating systems or, maintaining systems or scaling systems and adding something else to it, right? So like the most successful developers I have seen thrive in these last couple of years have been developers that have actually uh, moved laterally, when it comes to expanding their surface area, like maybe gotten a little more product savvy, maybe gotten a little more business savvy, where now they are, connecting business outcomes to what they've been doing. Because again, writing code has gotten commoditized, right? And it's not just writing code as well. I mean, it's also maintaining systems. And there are a few dozen companies now that'll sell you an SRE in a box or DevOps engineer in a box, right? Which claims to reduce mean time to resolution, or just make sure your system is running all the time. Because again, DevOps is just a different flavor of engineering, and all of that is being short circuited. So, like, I'll give you an example. The other day, I was talking to one of the developers. We had this, without going into too much detail, we had this flow in the product where we were deciding whether to implement it in one particular direction or something else. And this person tells me that, well, that's really a product call or just like a business call, that's like, I'm just an engineer. Like, and I had to coach them. It was like, no, you know what? That answer may have been fine back in 2018 or 2015, but that's not going to sustain in 2026. When I ask you a question, I expect a holistic answer, something that shows me you have done your research, you have thought about this problem in its whole sense and not just the coding element of it, right? So what a great answer would have looked like in that particular scenario is like, well, if we do approach A, we're gonna get this, we're gonna lose that. If we do approach B, we're gonna get this, we're gonna lose that. I don't think we have enough information to make the right decision. Let's go to product or let's go to the business and ask them for this insight, or maybe let's pull them into the loop that will help us decide between A and B, or maybe there's something else that we haven't even thought about, right? And I would love for every engineer and every practitioner to start thinking about the business implications of whatever system they are stewarding or managing or developing, as coming out of that shell of just like, well, I'm just a code monkey sitting here and typing out code in my IDE, and I'm just going to implement it to spec and then call it a day.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the challenge here is that if your company actually doesn't think of technology as your competitive advantage, and you are just doing things to spec, you are literally doing the job that LLMs are great at: translation from one set of words to another one. That is the optimal thing that. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you can't be in that position. I think that's going to make some people unhappy for sure. So I think one of the challenges here is that when you are in an interview as a candidate and you come in and you're trying to describe your stories, they're often focused on what happened in the moment, and they may never have actually thought about or been pushed to, like you're pushing your team to do, to actually think about the business. There were so many times I was hiring a staff engineer or a principal engineer, and they were telling me about some opportunity they had where they were trying to convince whole parts of their organization to switch technology or implement something new. And it was great. They had a great story about it. They had a PowerPoint about how they convinced everyone to switch to Kubernetes at the time. Whether or not that was the right choice or not was sort of beside the point. But when I probed them on that, they're like, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I'm like, okay, what was the business justification? What even led you to do this in the first place? Did you collect metrics or something about what was wrong with your current process, or perform an experiment that allowed you to validate your process? Like, oh, well, we didn't really do any of that. And I'm like, okay. And that was like almost 10 years ago that we saw that problem. And maybe they were getting away with it. They were successfully hired somewhere else. But now today, I feel like that's just not an option. And I will say, if your company does have some sort of software or technology as a competitive advantage, you absolutely can get away with just knowing the tech, right? If you are trying to optimize the amount of throughput through some low Wi-Fi device or a low battery device for Bluetooth or whatever, and you're innovating in this space, you absolutely can be the leader there without understanding the business impact. But I feel like also understanding how it fits into the product and the business is now more critical than ever.
100%, right? I mean, again, even optimizing, something as niche as, a low bandwidth Wi-Fi connection. I feel like you could run Claude or, any agentic harness in a loop, and eventually it'll crack it, right? Maybe not now. Maybe I'm pretty sure it could do it today, but certainly in a couple of years, it's going to do that, right? So like you have to start thinking about it as an owner, right? And I think what you put is really well, which is, you made this decision. Well, what were the business implications of it? Like, what were the motivations? And I like to call that an ownership mindset, right? Like, so think about yourself as a small business owner as opposed to an engineer, right? So like, think about whatever you own, like maybe it's a component, or maybe it's a system, or maybe, it's a set of a server fleet that you own. Just be like, oh, cool. Like, I am business owner of this fleet, and I'm going to allocate my time and my resources. And the resources could be, again, working with more junior engineers on the team. Maybe it's tokens, maybe it's something else. But like, how do you allocate time and money on a problem that you're solving such that you get the maximum return on investment, right? And if you think about that, and that's one of the signals that I try to suss for in an interview as well, right? Hey, have you been approaching things as an owner, or have you been approaching things as an employee, as a line employee who is just doing the things that have been told to them, right? Because again, if you're simply translating the spec from natural language into TypeScript or Terraform or something else, well, there's an expiration date on that, right? I mean, it's the same for the next 10 years for sure. I know that for sure. Like, it's not going to stay for the next 10 years. It may for the next 10 months.
I think we'll be in a little bit of disagreement about how far AI will get us in the future, for sure. So I don't know. I'll say my experiences with getting an arbitrary LLM to solve a problem is suspect at best, but there are for sure
Yeah.
things it does.
Yeah.
I'll say what's actually really interesting in this scenario isn't whether or not the LLM can solve it today or will solve it, but I think going back to the business perspective, it's how much money will your company be willing to spend to get that solved, right? If the LLM can solve it today and it costs you 100,000 to do it, is it worth actually running the LLM to make that happen? And that actually becomes the
Yeah.
conversation that you need to be having. And so I think from this regard, and you said you suss this out in interviews, my question is, do you feel like now, after, like maybe we should start at the top of the funnel, but I'll skip that for a moment. You get into the interview room with a candidate. Do you feel like you are now more so than historically turning down very deep expertise because they lack the business sense, and you're able to say, hey, you know what? 5, 10 years ago, I definitely would have hired this person. They're great in understanding the technology and implementing it. But when it comes to the holistic perspective, they just don't have that. Have you seen that more recently, or is it still about the same?
Yeah. First off, thanks for offering that, that other point of view. I feel like this is the new, VI versus Emacs, or, spaces versus tabs, whether it's going to be LLMs are going to be doing it or not, right? So I
Yeah.
absolutely love that. And I'm with you. I feel like human beings, bring a more holistic intelligence, at least today, with the technology that we have in front of us when it comes to solving problems. And I absolutely prize candidates who show a very deep expertise, in a particular field. So I would 100% hire them in a heartbeat. If I talk to somebody who's a undisputed, subject matter expert when it comes to distributed systems, or, database technology, or, somebody who has actually worked on something that can index or retrieve terabytes of data in every single hour or something of that sort. I mean, those are, it's a very rarefied field. I feel like the way it'll manifest is, or the way it has manifested for me in the last few months, has been stacking candidates against each other, right? So if you have like really expert level candidates, but one of them brings a better business, or, seems more business savvy, then I would go with that candidate compared to, somebody who is not quite as business savvy, or somebody, who just has thought about it. And so I feel like sometimes it also just comes down to being able to express opinions, right? I mean, you like, that's one of the things that I really look for when I'm interviewing candidates. Like, hey, do you have an opinion on this, right? I mean, you can't. So cool. Like you answered all of the questions, like the technology questions, right? You did fantastic in your systems design interview, and you did well in your coding interview and everything else. But most of the times I'm doing like the final culture fit interview, behavioral interview. And the thing that I'm looking for the most is, hey, can you share some opinions, like in a strong conviction based opinions on any topic, right? And typically it's AI, since, I'm usually hiring AI. So I'll ask them a question like, hey, pick an AI lab, and tell me how their safety policy differs from somebody else. Or, like there was this whole debate happening last week with open weight models versus closed source models, right? What's your opinion? Like which one is going to come out ahead in the next 3 years, in the next 10 years? And even when you ask candidates about, it's like, hey, what do you think? What's your perspective on this? That gives you an insight into, well, how deeply are they willing to venture outside of their technology expertise into, like, taking a step back and looking at, well, what's happening here? Like, what are the business implications of open weight models dominating the market versus, closed source models? And, how
Yeah.
is safety evolving? Or, what's what seems like the right policy? This seems like the right policy to me. And I love those answers, right? I mean, I feel like it's just so much more fun to work with people that have opinions on things, as opposed to somebody who's just going to narrowly implement something to spec, or just make sure that they're doing their slice of work really well. So that's really one of the things that I look for.
No, I think it's a critical
Yeah.
component of the behavioral interview. I think it's an interview that's often left off for a lot of companies, where they don't think about, how do
Yeah.
I actually get this candidate to talk about something core to who they are? And I mean, I think the opinion in question is great. My flavor is, I always ask, like, what's something you strongly believe that everyone else disagrees with you about? Trying to find those
Yeah.
niche areas where you have a unique perspective,
Yeah.
or you think you have a unique perspective. It's amazing how many times people just
Yeah.
share things that I think is prevalent. Maybe there's a whole community out there that you weren't even aware of that actually shared your, perfect ideal, and it gives you an opportunity to actually have that real conversation with a person, rather than talking about those, basic level stuff.
100%. Gosh, I love that question, by the way. I think Peter Thiel popularized that, tell me something most people disagree with you on. I have tried asking that question in interviews in the past, and I've yeah, maybe I should bring it back. Like I have,
I think there are
it's
always struggles.
sad. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's always struggles no matter what you pick to try to get to the right thing to talk about. And I think that's where a lot of interviewers that go into conversations aren't really well trained. They think it's all about the questions you're asking rather than trying to figure out how to suss out the conversation. Like if this line of questioning doesn't yield something interesting to discuss, then you need to pivot, or even after an answer, really dig in
Yeah.
and dive, use the 5 whys perspective to get to the root cause of like why they believe that thing or what's going on there. And so I think it's a mistake to just, oh yeah, I asked the question, I got the answer, my interviewing recording software captured it, so I can move on to the next thing. Like, no, you're not done yet. Really dive into that. Understand, why is that the thing that they're talking about or that they care about, or why open weight models actually do matter. Like, why is that important to them? Maybe they'll spill something about their core value system and how they approach
Yeah.
certain problems, or how they'll make,
Yeah.
future business decisions when you're not just, sitting there and evaluating everything that they're doing.
Totally, totally. Yeah. I love it when people, are able to, or candidates are able to tie down answers to, their values or, their beliefs, their core beliefs. And I feel like it's, that's really the thing that makes us human. And, I feel like it's just so much important to, lean into that in today's age, than just raw technical expertise, which is, I have the privilege of meeting so many smart candidates in the interview process, and they're all great, right? I mean, like everyone has done deep work on accumulating years and years of technical expertise, and they really know how to operate a system or develop something. But then that's great. But then, hey, what is something that makes you uniquely human? I was watching this show on Apple TV a few months ago, Pluribus, where it just becomes like the whole of humanity is just reduced to like one hive mind, which kind of feels like an LLM. It's a pretty good show, and that really sparked something in me. It's like, wow, this is. It's a really good take on what makes us all uniquely human, right? It's not just being human. Like you have to be human, that's one thing, but then you also, each of us is unique, right? We each human being brings a unique perspective and judgment when it comes to seeing the world around them and influencing the world around them, and that's really becoming so much more important in today's age. And I hear you, by the way. It's not perfect. No large enterprise is trusting raw LLM outputs to like directly go into production, right? I mean, there are like lots of safeguards in place. There were humans in the loop everywhere. If you look at Anthropic and OpenAI, they're hiring people as well, right? So, which should tell you everything as to what it's important, right? In this industry.
Yeah. Maybe we won't get too much into that. I think we'll have a whole dedicated episode on
Yeah.
harnesses where we build something internally and we can get into more of the technology side. So at some point, you're going to end up with the resumes in your, I assume, applicant tracking system, ATS,
Hmm.
where you're tracking everything. And at this point, let's say for a single role that you're trying to fill, I don't know if you're trying to fill multiple at the same time, uh, how many resumes are you looking at about per job?
Yeah, so or the tool that we use, the application tracking system, gives us a pretty good way to like look at resumes. One thing I've come to appreciate about this tool is that it doesn't allow us to, filter out resumes based on really broad filters. So I can't be like, hey, only show me candidates who have previously worked at Google or previously worked at Amazon, right? So like, which is a good design. I feel like it just removes a lot of bias from the
Oh, for
application
sure.
tracking system. So you have to like look at every resume, right? Like it doesn't, you look at a resume and you can either bin it or you can pin it for later on. But a finer point that I would like to put on it is, when we go from a couple of hundred resumes to a single hiring manager screen, there's also another step in between, which is a talent acquisition or the recruiter screen, right? So like my TA partners screen a few more candidates, right? So like maybe from like and I'll have to look at the exact numbers, but from 200, maybe it's like 20 recruiter screens, which then yield one hiring manager screen, right? So my recruiting partners will, run like the first layer,
Yeah.
and then we're not scheduling one HM screen from like a pile of 200 resumes. We're actually, giving, or we're actually selecting a few more, and then that results in typically one HM screen.
So that's like almost. I mean, if you say 20 to 1, there we're at 2,000 resumes per one candidate that makes it to the hiring manager phone screen, likely, assuming that's your next step. So
Yeah.
what are your sort of the HR representatives looking for at this spot sort of today? Do you know what they're sort of gauging?
Yeah, so that's really just comes down to logistics. Like where are you based? are your compensation expectations in line with, what we have advertised? How soon can you start? That sort of stuff.
Okay, so now let's get to the interesting part. Of course, after that, there's a step where they get to meet with someone potentially.
Yeah.
If you're a remote company, what does that mean for you, and what are you looking for at that stage?
Yeah. So the first real interview is the hiring manager interview, right? So which is a 30 or 45-minute interview with whoever the hiring manager is. If I'm the hiring manager, maybe it's one of the managers on my team who's hiring a rec. And in that interview, we really try to understand, dig a little bit deeper into, where this candidate is coming from, like ask them to tell their story, like probe into a few technical details about, like, hey, so tell me something about interesting that you learned during your past experience, or, tell me an area where you grew in your last, your last role. Those sort of questions, just to understand, where they're really coming from. One of my favorite questions to ask during this interview is I ask candidates like, hey, tell me, what are you looking for in your next role? And it's shocking how many people, they don't have a good answer for that, right? I mean, like they will, like when I was like, hey, so what are you looking for in your next role? And they will tell me context about why they want to leave their existing job, right? So like the answer is about like, hey, I'm running away from this thing. And that's not what I want to hear. I want to hear, why are you running toward this? Like, have you done your homework about, what this role is? What am I hiring for? And that's really how great candidates stand out in that process, right? So like being able to really have a good answer when you're asked, hey, what is it that you're looking for in your next role? Because then that's going to allow me to see how that aligns well with what we have to offer in a job. And if, those two things line up. So that's one of my favorite questions. Then I just basically listened to the question and answered the question, as opposed to, like, the question is not, why are you leaving your job?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's very similar to I mean, I think it evolved from not a great place, which is why, what we've ended up with is a much better question. But it used to be like, where do you envision yourself in 5 years? And that was never that Yeah, I mean, that was never that helpful. And I do think that it's also evolved from the question of like, why do you want this job? What do you love about our company? And I'm like, I don't need you to have reviewed all our company's financials and past products and have strong opinions about that. That's sort of orthogonal a lot. And you know what? A lot of people don't have a direct impact on, well, they have an impact on the business, like on the sort of leadership direction that we're taking or as a product. And I don't necessarily expect you to have a strong opinion there, but maybe there's a whole bunch of area, depending on the scope of what you're being hired for, to have an expectation on that. And I think for sure, when they tell me about the problems that they had at previous jobs, I always say, no job is going to be perfect. Tell me about what problems you want to solve, and like which things do you want to be broken at our company, and then it's much easier to find a match there, because historically there are problems everywhere. There is no like you get there and you do nothing the whole day. I think the XKCD Randall Monroe says, when asked what is your perfect job, it says, I want to basically live in retirement and then come out and be told you get to put lightsabers through solid objects and that's what we use for testing purposes. And they'd be like, yeah, sure, I'll take that job. But I think most jobs are not that. But that being said, I think a lot of people do have a preference for solving certain kinds of problems. Like for me, I love, scaling stuff up. I love reliability challenges or long-term distributed systems with needs. And so, everyone has those sorts of things. And I feel like that's really what you're trying to get out of the candidate. And people who have thought about that, especially when you're at 5 years plus, you've seen some things already. Please have seen some things already and have opinions. As you pointed out, what are your opinions? It goes in, what are the problems that you want to solve?
100%, right? Couldn't agree more. It just signals, a high intention or, a more intentional candidate than a passive candidate, right? I mean, like if you really haven't thought about what you want in your next role, like if you don't know that you prefer working on distributed systems or front end or, whatever it is, like, hey, this is what I'm, looking to. I'm an expert in, like, a good answer would sound something like, hey, I'm an expert in so-and-so technology, and I'm looking to apply that technology to solve new and interesting problems in that domain. And, your company is solving those problems, and that's why I'm really interested in this role. That sounds like a great answer to me, as opposed to, well, there's like a lot of reorgs happening in my job right now, so I'm just looking around, which is, like, it doesn't really inspire confidence, right? I mean, I want somebody who is excited to work, alongside us just as much as we are excited to have them.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And you know what? The interesting thing is we do get those candidates, and my question is, okay, basically you're here to learn something about the market. And I'm like, great. What do you want to learn? And I want to hear it answered. Like, if you're doing research, tell me about how you're doing research. Because if
Right.
you're like,
Yeah.
I don't even know how to do research, then I'm like, okay, you're here. You don't want a job. You don't know why you're here or what you're trying to find out.
Yeah.
Like, are we done?
Yeah. Exactly. Right. I mean, it's a waste of time for everyone. So that's, fortunately, like most candidates that I speak with do have a good answer. And,
Yeah,
they do know that they want to work with a great team, right? I mean, that's a
yeah,
fantastic answer, right? It's like, hey, what do you
yeah.
want in your next role? Well, I want to work with great, fantastic people. It's like, boom, we have that. I want to work remotely. I'm not able to commute in or something. Fantastic. I'll take that. It doesn't have to be about, the technology or like, how good you're at a certain thing. It's just like, be intentional, be opinionated, and, tell me what is it that you're looking for in your next role.
I think self-awareness is how I would describe a lot of this, of like what you
Yeah.
like as a person. Because, honestly, even pre-pandemic, we started out as a remote company as well. And one of the challenges we had is a lot of people were like, oh, yeah, remote company, I want to work for them. My first question was, have you ever worked for a remote company before? Do you actually know what working for a remote company means? It's like, oh, yeah, actually, I have no idea. I've never worked for one. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well, number one thing, you may have been substituting work for your social needs and your obligations to yourself and feeling like
Yeah.
you are part of something. And now you're no longer going to have that. How do you compensate with that? And a lot of them are like, I have no response to that. I have never thought about it. I'm like, you may not be cut out for this because a year or two down the line, you may be like, I love working from anywhere. I love doing this sort of stuff, but you're going to get burned out if you haven't thought about it. So I think the self-awareness angle is really critical here when it comes to the types of companies that you want to work for, the specific roles you're going at, and those things that you're asking for. It's not arbitrary.
100%. Yeah, that's a really good point, about just having your social, you're substituting office
Yeah.
culture like a social life. Yeah,
Yeah.
hadn't considered that.
I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing with the other aspect that mentioned. I think a lot of people bring this up. I think the number one and two lies that inexperienced engineers tell themselves is, "I want to work with a great team and I want to solve hard problems." And I think a lot of people don't want to solve hard problems. And working with a great team,
Yeah.
I don't think they know what that is. A lot of them may substitute like working with like maybe people that have been in the industry a while or have interesting stories, but then you find out, oh, they're super opinionated and they always disagree with me, and it's very difficult to
Yeah.
have a real conversation, and maybe you just don't gel well. And I feel like that's not well thought about. So I feel like really understanding what they want there is part on the candidate, but also really on the interviewer. I mean, you go through hundreds of interviews or thousands, and you start to get a good feeling of like when candidates haven't really thought through what they're
Hmm.
saying. They're repeating something that they heard, which may have sounded good at the time, but when you dive into it, it's like, if someone had asked me, I think I was one of these failures early on where I repeated, I want to solve challenging problems that are interesting, and I'm like, I don't actually know what that means.
I feel like we have all been there, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we have all that's I feel like, but you're right. I mean, solving hard problems just means banging your head against a wall for, just finding a solution, being disappointed that you haven't found a solution, and just having that tenacity required to, break through, eventually finding something out there, right? So it just requires so much more patience. And, you might go days or weeks without a dopamine hit of, having solved something because it's a hard problem, right? That's
yeah.
what it's all about.
Yeah, I think this is what I'll say is no one likes solving hard problems. They like solving problems that are just at the edge of the solution space that they can solve. Uh,
Yeah.
like if it's
Yeah.
too easy, it's like that's boring. And if you
Yeah.
aren't capable of solving it, then you just get frustrated. You want like a little bit of frustration, and then it's solved. And I think that's what actually people want. And if you don't think about it enough, you don't really realize that's the challenge there.
100%.
Maybe
Yeah.
before we spend too much time,
Yeah.
talking about that,
Yeah.
I think the question I have to ask you here is already at this sort of phone screening level with the hiring
Yeah.
manager. Are you already starting to see LLM tools being used, interview assistants that help candidates cheat? And how are you sort of detecting that and handling that scenario?
Yeah, I feel like that's more of an art than a science at this point, right? I mean, you can get really good at this. I mean, there are all kinds of cheating tools available to candidates. I mean, we used to have really billboards here in the city a few months ago. I think they took that down. You could, candidates again, candidates were using a second screen next to their computer, which was, doing things, taking really long pauses. And I feel like, when you're interviewing some, let me tell you about candidates that do well. Candidates who do well are focused on talking, right? They don't use a virtual background. They use a real background. It doesn't have to be you don't have to be sitting in a beautiful office or something like this. You can be in your bedroom, doesn't matter, right? But it just gives me an extra layer of confidence that you're like it's daytime where you are, for example. Like just those subtle things. Something else that comes to mind is they have a high bandwidth connection. Like don't have connection problems. Like connection, if you have connection problems, or if you have like a latency or a lag, if you're maybe you're using a VPN, who knows, right? I mean, like there's just all these subtle things. If you're having genuine internet problems, just let's move the call, let's reschedule it to a different time. More than happy to do that. So those are some of the things. And we've seen somebody was sharing with me yesterday about how a viral video about moving a hand in front of the candidate. Like I haven't ever done that, but that's it's easy to tell when you're not talking to an actual person and you're talking to an avatar.
I feel like it's one of those things that, will get passed around as sort of a solution, but it's sort of fake, right? Like
Yeah.
if they were, I mean, I think this is where you have to really evaluate your threat model and whether or not the sort of candidates you're getting are problematic there. But I don't know that there's, as you said, I don't know there's an optimal solution for this. Otherwise, other than just dealing with it as it comes up. I mean, if a candidate can fake their whole way through the interview and also
Yeah.
multiple years at your job, either you have a terrible way of evaluating candidates, or they're doing a great job, and who cares that they've done it
Who
up to
cares,
this
right? I
point?
mean, like, yeah. Right. Like a whole different meaning to fake it till you make it.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, that was always my
Yeah.
perspective here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's it. I think there are way worse scenarios there where you hire a real candidate, you validated everything, and then they get to the job and they're just mediocre and constantly
Yeah.
need support to stay at that level. Otherwise, they'll trail off, unfortunately. Okay, so realistically, it's an art for evaluating whether or not it's a real person. I think the other one that I've seen is it is a real person, but they're standing in for someone else, or they have a team working behind them. Something I started to see now is there'll be like a group of people that are all searching together, and now while one person is doing their interview, the other people are all supporting them in some way by helping to figure out answers to questions. I don't know if these are sorts of things that you've seen or had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been, they could have been looking at another person for guidance as opposed to a screen, right? Maybe I shouldn't just say that they're looking at a screen, but I've definitely experienced people who are not focused on, the screen and, getting information fed into or being put in front of them by some other means. 100%. I mean, that's, I can see that, right? And I don't look, I mean, I don't blame people. It's hard. It's hard to find a job. It's hard to get a job, right? So people are, everyone's doing the best that they can. But then again, like you want to hire somebody who is genuinely good at their job and, who is a genuine, authentic person, and who's going to help our business move forward in the right way.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. I mean, this is what we talked about the whole time. Okay, so you sign off on them. You think that they're a real person. They have good answers to why they want this particular job or what they're
Yeah.
specifically looking for, and they seem like some sort of fit. And I assume then I don't know if you have I mean, just tell me about what's next.
Yeah, so if they do well, then they get advanced to an interview loop, and the interview loop again depends on the role that we are hiring for. If you're hiring for an AI systems engineer, or an AI product engineer, or an AI research engineer, it looks a little bit different, but more or less, there's a system design component to it. If you're more senior in your career, there's a couple of system design interviews where you're talking about a large solution, where you're whiteboarding using Excalibur, or one of the screen sharing tools. By the way, when it comes to sharing your screen, I love it when candidates share their entire screen. I don't ask them to do it, but sometimes they just do it. Like, when we're whiteboarding together, I feel nice when they do that. So system design interviews, that are meant to test our systems, talk about scale, just show a level of knowledge and expertise about the broader system as a whole. We also have a coding interview as a part of the interview process where you're expected to write some code without the help of LLMs. Obviously, for we're not testing. This is not an eval on Fable. or GPT solve. It's an eval on you as a person, right? So like we want to test how well you're doing as a person. There's a coding interview, and then there's a behavioral interview. If you're hiring for a manager, if I'm hiring a manager, if I'm hiring a principal engineer, there's a couple of behavioral interviews because then you have an outsized impact on the rest of the organization. The organization is going to look up to you, and we just have like more questions that we would like to put in front of you, and get a signal on how you think about different situations and how do you behave when you're put in a variety of situations, growing the team, turning around somebody who's not performing well, etc. Those are more on the managerial side, though.
So something interesting that you mentioned is that realistically, you're expecting the candidates not to use LLMs during the interview process. And I'm curious, how does that match up with how they'll function once they get their, let's say you do hire them successfully.
Yeah.
Is there an expectation that they can use LLMs there as part of their jobs, or do you have a similar expectation that often the work that they're doing wouldn't match well with using an LLM?
No, we use LLMs quite a bit. We use agentic coding quite a bit here at the company. There's all sorts of tools, right? People use Cursor, people use Cloud Code, we also have this custom harness that our CTO wrote himself.
Oh no.
It's fantastic. It works really well. So we lean on agentic coding a lot, but then again, agentic coding is going to generate code and it's going to put code in front of you. And then as a human developer, your responsibility, you should be able to look at the code and tell me whether it's good code or bad code, right? You're the judge, right? Of what the output of the agentic coding system is. So when you're testing in an interview, you do want to test candidates' skills in terms of how well they can write code without an LLM. And then obviously, when they join, they use the same expertise, the same knowledge, but they're not using that to author code. They're using that to review code, and obviously authoring it where it makes sense.
So where we have them do the part of the coding interview, we actually tell them that we expect them, if they want, to use an LLM because we want as much to match their, say, production usage as what they're comfortable with. And I feel like, I don't know, like we don't have an expectation that people use LLMs, to do the software development specifically.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a weird question there, but I feel like I don't have a problem with someone that uses LLMs all the time to do their software development and then come to the interview. I don't necessarily want to take that away, but I do have to say a little bit of a different expectations of what they're going through with that process. And I often wonder when there are companies out there, and maybe you can share a little bit about this, that don't allow LLMs during the process. Do you think that you would come up with a future interview that specifically tests their capabilities there, maybe with whatever they're used to, like, or if they're getting into problems, like if there's a scenario where, and I don't know what I would do here because just earlier I was using my harness that was backed by, I don't remember what it was. I think it was Quen, and it was incredibly obstinate about doing something and just saying, no, I won't do that. I refuse. I was changing code. It's like one of the LLMs. I mean, and that's one of the maddening things. It was another one where it was, I wanted it to fix some unit tests because it had hacked its way through to make the unit tests work. And I specifically wrote some other code that would fail if the code wasn't fixed correctly. And I tried to get to fix the unit test. Instead of fixing it, it just kept going back and undoing the error that I made to force the test to be fixed rather than fixing it. Right. And it was a sub-agent problem. Like the main agent understood what I wanted, but failed to convey to whatever sub-agent it was talking to make the right thing happen. And I feel like there are some of these things which could start interesting conversations, but I think the question is the surface area. If people are using some sort of software development tool, I mean, they're using an IDE or they're using an LLM, and I think that's a sort of another point in their production workloads when they're actually doing software development, I want to sort of see a similar thing early on so I can understand how they engage with that. A good example was a lot of years ago, I took a bunch of software engineering tests to get jobs. This is probably 20 years ago at this point. And the two things that mattered to me the most, they're both healthcare companies, actually. The first one wanted me to do software development on a piece of paper. And you learn very early on when you do this, I hope no one ever has to do this ever again. You leave a lot of white space between every single line of code
Yeah.
you
You can
write,
go back and say,
because
yeah.
you will have to move variables around. You will have to erase things, and
Yeah.
there's nothing more maddening than
Yeah.
erasing the same line 100 times. Be like, no, I wanted to find the variables over here and not there. And you can't copy and paste on a piece of paper. The same thing goes with this other one where they're like, your IDE is going to be a text editor. Google did this to me. A healthcare
Yeah.
company did this to me. I'm like, who programs in Word of all things, or like text pad with no formatting whatsoever? It's just
Yeah.
it's a
In Times New
ridiculous.
Roman.
Right. Well, so it's like no keyword highlighting. Like
Yeah.
I click tab all the time
Yeah.
for keyword analysis or copy and paste and just find and replace. And those things just don't work for me. And I wonder, how many points I got off because I wasn't able to use their ID that they provided to me, be it a piece of paper or,
Yeah.
a terminal editor. And I worry that in some cases we're doing similar things to the candidates today.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like my take on this is that I draw the line between a tool and intelligence, right?
Mm,
So you should have whatever tools, right? So you're encouraged to just share your screen and use whatever editor you want. Just show me that you as a human being are capable of writing code without like using your own intelligence or designing a system or whatever it is, right? Using your own intelligence as opposed to using the intelligence provided to you by an LLM, right? I mean,
yeah.
you're going to get to use that as a part of your job, but testing how well somebody can operate a harness like Claude Code. And again, the other thing is that the harnesses and, the models underneath those harnesses are getting so freakishly good that a lot of times they'll just one shot the right answer for you, right? So like you go in and it's like, okay, cool. Like, hey, you're allowed to use an LLM for this coding interview, this portion of the coding interview. And, they prompt it right. And it's like, boom, it's done. It's like, okay, cool. I guess the interview is over now. Or you can ask follow-up questions. And again, you can, like prompt your way through it, etc. You can maybe ask them to like make some modifications. Or you can be like, hey, why do you think this, what the LLM generated, why do you think this is better? Why do you think that's worse? And we'll probably introduce a LLM code review round, down the line. We have tested some alpha versions of that internally. We haven't just deployed that into our production hiring pipeline, if you will. But I think that's coming. But yeah, that's where I really draw the line. Is like, hey, I want to test the intelligence and the judgment that you as a human being are bringing into the process, or
Right.
will be bringing into the team, as opposed to your how well you're able to operate a harness. Because guess what, the harnesses are also getting really good at what they are doing, right? So there was a point in time, like 2 or 3 years ago, where you had to be really good at prompting, and you had to like prompt in a certain way to get the right answer. And now, because of all the reinforcement learning that has been going into these models, even a poor quality prompt will generate the same high quality output as a high quality prompt would generate, right? So like LLMs are getting really good at inferring intent and inferring sort of like, what did you really mean, even if your prompt was not of the highest quality. And
Yeah.
I expect that to continue. I expect that to continue to, just keep on getting better at inferring for input and generating high quality output based off of it.
I definitely want to stay away from are the models getting better, because that there are rants there that we can definitely get into for sure.
I mean, it's yeah, totally, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much on this topic specifically, and I'm trying to think what the best thing to particularly add is. I think that there are some struggles with no matter what the interview practice is that we have in place, and I think if a candidate is just prompting a model to get an answer, there is a question of, is there a way we can change the interview practice or interview process, the particular round, to better adhere to what we're actually looking for? I totally get at the end of the day. Now, maybe the message is fundamentally LLMs suck. They're all wrong. They're terrible. And so if you just jump in an interview and immediately are putting stuff in there, then it's easy for me to see that it's not the right thing. And if as a candidate, you disagree with this practice, then maybe it's not a good fit for the role, because we expect candidates to be cautious of what comes out of LLMs. And so there shouldn't be an expectation that it makes sense to use this particular tool when you're going out and doing it. No different than if you jumped into a monolith repository with tons of different functions in place that you have built up over lots of decades, you may know what functions are there, what sort of wrappers exist, and using those. And we're not going to test you on your skills of your previous job that made sense, where we need to look at our environment that we have at this moment, whether or not you are able to operate in it. And I don't know what the time frame is, maybe 6 months for value from the cost of the actual interview round for it to make sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So One thing I want to ask is whether or not fundamentally at this time in the interview process, and maybe this is a good place for to stop rather than continuing on what happens after, is do you have expectations or do you share with candidates a sort of playbook of what they should be expecting when they come to the individual rounds? And what I mean by that is Amazon has sort of pioneered or made hugely popular this idea of answering in a star format. That's the
Hmm.
the problem at hand, the action you took,
Yeah.
the consequences and the results, basically. And obviously, this is helpful, but I worry that not every candidate comes to the table understanding or having been coached in that way. And I hate to turn down candidates that haven't spent hours and hours practicing interviews before they get on a call or to the interview round. And I'm not sure if you've thought about how to deal with that or you been dealing with that.
Yeah, yeah. So we do educate candidates on the interview process as a part of that's one of the things that happens in the talent acquisition round. That happens early on before the manager, or even sometimes after the manager HM screen. It's like, oh, I recommend somebody to go ahead. Before they jump into the interviews, our recruiting team will share with them what to expect in the interview, how to answer questions, etc. Yeah, the star, is a pretty. I guess it's a pretty popular pattern for answering behavioral questions, but certainly it doesn't have to be that. I think it just encourages you to be more structured and cohesive, as opposed to just keep on rambling about different things and like switching gears too much. But so, I've had candidates give me fantastic answers that I was able to understand. Like they answered my questions, like, and they were able to give a really cohesive answer without really just like, oh well, this was the situation, and then this was the task, and then this was the result. You don't have to follow that thing, but
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Realistically, I think if in a way it's too structured, isn't necessarily good either, or mechanical. If I wanted mechanical answers, I would have prepared the whole list for you
yeah,
beforehand and sent it to you so that you could automatically fill it out and we could read that response. And that's not really what it's about either. Plus, I don't like
yeah,
penalizing candidates for not having memorized a particular way of doing this. I do agree with you that a huge part of our
yeah,
job is communicating. And if you're going to use an LLM at work, communicating with, unfortunately, an agentic tool to make it do the right thing is critical. And so if you can't do that in some way that is understandable by every other person that you're trying to communicate with, then that fundamentally is an issue for getting hired into a position. Okay, so I think at this point, let's move over to picks. So Nikhil, what have you brought for our audience today?
yeah. So what I want to share with you today is a book written by Jocko Willing. Jocko is a former Navy SEAL. Is an awesome person. Who he's also an author as well, and he writes about leadership and how do you be a really good leader, be a really good employee, be a really good teammate. In his book, the book is called Leadership Strategy and Tactics: A Field Manual. And we all know that leadership, or like modern organizational philosophy, really all can be dated back, to the military, to the armed forces, right? I mean, that's where we as a society first started organizing, right? So like it was hundreds of years ago, right? So like a lot of leadership principles that we have in modern corporate America stem from, military practices. And that was like one of the really cool things was, just tying that to like, practical incidents that have happened, on the battlefield, like how do you watch out for the person next to you? How do you really shine in a team setting? How do you overcome obstacles? How do you, show up for your team, for your manager, for the business, for the company? Just really laid out. And, that's really influenced, who I am as a leader. And yeah, highly recommend people reading that book.
I hadn't heard of that one, so something to definitely check out. I feel like there's a lot of things coming out of the U.S. Navy Armed Forces branch compared to the other ones that have a lot of things to say about leadership. I mean, we've got Turn the Ship Around.
Yeah.
There's another one about that I totally forgot the name of, which talks about sort of how they build their units. I know Adam Grant has done things with the Navy about evaluating like how they pick candidates. Actually, that was also the Marines, and I think it's really interesting to try to pick and choose, seeing those leadership examples, especially from rigorous attention to how these things are supposed to work, rather than the sort of off firing from the hip, if you will,
Yeah.
of the tech world of how we do things may or may not be successful.
100%, right? I mean, like, yeah, the armed forces really have that dialed down. And how do you lead a really large organization into battle? Like you're also asking people to sometimes make the ultimate sacrifice, which is just really is it seeps back and back propagates to the entire leadership philosophy. Make sacrifices to keep your team moving forward, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There's a lot more at risk for them for sure than whatever
100%,
we're
yeah.
worried about with whatever product we're making.
100%, yeah. Not even close.
Yeah. Okay. So my pick. I just brought maybe a little bit lame YouTube short, which makes it easy for everyone to watch. No high commitment, but the speaker in it is pretty, I'll say famous, but you can see him on a bunch of different things and is always a joy to listen to. And this particular one was when Sony made Walkman players worse to sell more. Honestly, it's from the genius of Rory Sutherland. He runs an ad agency, Ogilvy Group. And
Yeah.
the thing from the episode is don't make your product confusing for the market segment you're trying to sell to. In the case of the Walkman, I think it was justification to remove the recording button from cassette players because the people they were selling to wouldn't have a need for that particular feature. Without the button, it's clear, it plays something. But as soon as you add the record button, well, what does it do? Well, it records sometimes and then plays other times. Is it only for recording? And then you see a whole bunch of other devices, like is it for business or is it for consumers? And it's very difficult. But as soon as you decide, no, it's for the masses, it's for most people, consumers to play stuff, then you realize that this isn't necessary. And I think it was actually maybe even more expensive to have to remove the button. I had to go back to the drawing, had to do more R&D on it for sure. But I feel like this is something that a lot of people could learn when they're thinking about what their product should be. And maybe we can tie it back into the interviewing process where, as we talked about, thinking about upfront, who is it that we want to hire? What is the purpose?
100%. Yeah. I love that. Make it simple. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think, in the world, we're like, one more certification, one more technology on your resume means you're maybe a little bit better of a candidate. But in the end, if you don't need that, maybe the other areas that person fills in the gap for is much better. And they won't bring those extra biases for them. Like I love the obscuring previous companies people have worked at. If you don't know they worked at Google or that they did, you no longer use that as a signal, positive or negative, if you will, for a judgment. But you remove it and now you're in a much better position for hiring the right candidate.
100%. I agree more.
Okay. Nikhil, I think we've come to a close here. Thanks so much for joining for this episode. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that the audience has figured out how they're going to land their next job effectively.
Awesome. Thank you, Warren. Really great chatting with you this morning.
Yeah. And thanks for all the viewers for tuning in for this episode. And I hope to see everyone back again next week.